Tonight, we're stepping into a world where a careless word could cost you your life, where honor was worth more than breath itself, and where dawn often brought not just light, but the crack of pistols and the whisper of steel. We're diving deep into the shadowed history of dueling, that ancient ritual where men settled their differences not in courts of law, but on fields of honor, with blood and courage as their only witnesses. This is a story told from an unusual angle. You won't just be reading about duels from the safe distance of history books. Instead, you'll walk alongside a man who lived this life, who felt the weight of a sword in his hand and the cold knot of fear in his stomach as dawn broke over a misty field. You'll understand why seemingly rational men would risk everything for something as intangible as honor, and why this practice, though it seems barbaric to modern eyes, made perfect sense in the world that created it. The dawn mist clings to everything. Your boots are soaked through from the wet grass, but you barely notice. Your hands are steady as you check your pistol one final time, though your heart pounds like a war drum in your chest. Across the field, 30 paces away, another man stands in the gray morning light. Yesterday, he was a stranger. Tonight, one of you might be dead. Tomorrow, if you both survive, you might become the closest of friends. Such was the strange mathematics of dueling, where violence and honor became hopelessly entangled, where death and dignity walked hand in hand into the mist. What follows is drawn from historical accounts, memoirs, and records of the dueling era, while the specific individual whose voice you'll hear is a composite. Every detail, every rule, every social pressure described comes directly from documented history. This is what life was truly like for those who lived by the code of honor. Picture a morning in 1783. The fog hangs heavy over a quiet field just outside Paris, clinging to the grass like ghostly fingers. Two men stand 30 paces apart, pistols held loosely at their sides, their faces showing calm even though their hearts pound beneath their coats. Behind each man stands a second, a trusted friend who has spent the past week trying desperately to find a peaceful solution. Those attempts have failed. The cause of this confrontation? A comment made at a card game 3 nights ago. One man suggested the other had cheated. Words were exchanged. Insults flew like daggers. And now, here they stand, 2 human lives balanced on the razor's edge of a misunderstanding that spiraled into something far darker. This was dueling, not the romanticized, swashbuckling affairs of novels and films, but real fights where real men shed real blood over matters of honor that, to modern minds, seem impossibly small and silly. Yet for centuries, across Europe and the Americas, dueling wasn't just accepted, it was expected. To refuse a challenge was to mark yourself as a coward, to accept social death even as you preserved your physical life. But how did we arrive at this point? How did civilized societies come to accept, even celebrate, the practice of 2 men trying to kill each other over an insult? And what was it like to live as a duelist, to walk through life knowing that any social misstep, any perceived slight, could lead you to a field at dawn with a weapon in your hand and death staring you in the face? To understand dueling, we must first understand honor. In the societies where dueling flourished, honor wasn't just a nice quality to possess. It was everything. Based on countless letters, memoirs, and contemporary accounts, we can see that a man's honor determined his place in society, his chances for marriage, his ability to do business, his very identity. A man without honor was a man without worth, a ghost walking through society, ignored by everyone who mattered. And honor, that fragile, precious thing, could be damaged by the smallest slight, the faintest insult, even by the tone someone used when speaking to you. Once damaged, it had to be restored. And in many circles, violence was seen as the only way to fix it. Think about that for a moment. In our modern world, if someone insults us, we might respond with words, we might complain to friends, we might file a lawsuit if the insult causes real damage. But we don't generally try to kill the person. The very idea seems crazy, criminal, insane. Yet for centuries, among the upper classes of Europe and America, that was exactly what happened. A man could lose his entire social position, his business chances, his family's standing, simply by refusing to fight when challenged. The duel was both the disease and the cure, creating conflicts while claiming to solve them. The roots of dueling stretch deep into history, connected to medieval traditions of trial by combat and judicial duels. In those early days, combat was actually a legally approved method of settling disputes. If one man accused another of a serious crime, they could settle the matter through organized combat. People believed that God would make sure the righteous party would win, that divine justice would guide the sword arm of the innocent and doom the guilty. It was called ordeal by combat, and it was shockingly common throughout medieval Europe. Knights clad in full armor would clash in formal combat, often to settle accusations of serious crimes like murder or treason. These weren't quick affairs. Men fought with heavy weapons, in full plate armor, until one was dead, incapacitated, or admitted defeat. The Normans brought this practice to England in 1066, and it remained a legal option for dispute resolution for centuries. One of the last recorded trials by combat in England took place in 1446, and the practice wasn't officially abolished until 1819, which means it remained on the books well into the modern era, a medieval relic surviving in a changing world. But the dueling we're discussing tonight evolved from something different. It emerged during the Renaissance, particularly in Italy, as a more personal affair removed from the legal system. This was when everything changed. When the Renaissance swept through Italy in the 15th and 16th centuries, it brought with it a transformed view of honor and personal dignity. The old feudal system was giving way to something new, and with it came new ideas about what made a man worthy of respect. The Italian Renaissance invented the gentleman as we understand the concept, not just a man of good birth, but a man of culture, education, refined manners, and yes, the ability to defend his honor with violence when necessary. Books appeared laying out proper gentleman behavior. Baldassare Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier became the guide for how a Renaissance gentleman should act, and it clearly stated that a true gentleman must be prepared to fight duels. When the rapier replaced the heavy broadsword, combat became more elegant, more deadly, more individualized. The long, slender blade of the rapier was designed not for hacking at armor, but for precise thrusts that could slip between ribs and pierce vital organs with surgical precision. Fencing masters opened schools throughout Italy, teaching young noblemen the art of the sword. These weren't just physical training centers. They were finishing schools where young men learned the entire culture of honor and violence that defined their class. The fencing schools of Renaissance Italy were remarkable institutions. Young men from noble families would spend years studying under master swordsmen, learning not just how to fight, but the entire philosophy of combat and honor. Masters like Fiore de' Liberi, Achille Marozzo, and later Ridolfo Capoferro, whose treatises survive to this day, taught their students that the sword was an extension of will, that combat was a mental game as much as a physical one, and that a true swordsman fought with his mind as much as his blade. These manuals are fascinating documents. They're filled with detailed pictures showing positions, guards, and attacks, but they also dig into the psychology of combat. They discuss how to read an opponent, how to control fear, how to stay calm when death is inches away. They taught that waiting too long meant death, that committing to a course of action was essential, but that blind aggression would get you killed just as surely as cowardice. The sword, they said, was the weapon of the thinking man, the gentleman who combined physical skill with mental control. From Italy, dueling culture spread throughout Europe like wildfire. France embraced it with particular enthusiasm. The French nobility, always conscious of status and honor, took to dueling with an almost religious fervor. By the 17th century, France had become the dueling capital of Europe. Duels were fought over everything: insults, political disagreements, romantic rivalries, even matters of precedence at court. Two men might duel over who should walk through a doorway first, who had the right to a particular seat at a gathering, or whose hat was more fashionable. The statistics are shocking. It's estimated that during the reign of Henry IV of France, from 1589 to 1610, about 10,000 duels took place, involving 20,000 participants and resulting in 4,000 to 5,000 deaths. Think about those numbers. In just over 20 years, the French nobility killed 4,000 of their own over matters of honor. That's not counting those wounded or hurt for life. The upper class was literally killing itself off through dueling. King after king tried to stop it. Henry IV banned dueling. Louis XIII outlawed it in 1626. Louis XIV intensified enforcement, sometimes executing famous duelists as examples. Cardinal Richelieu made suppression of dueling a personal mission, famously executing the Count of Bouteville in 1627 despite pleas for clemency. Bouteville had fought 22 duels and killed multiple men. His execution was meant to terrify the nobility into obedience. It didn't work. French officers fought 10,000 duels between 1685 and 1716, resulting in over 400 deaths. The bans were ignored, the punishments rarely applied consistently. Why? Because dueling had become so deeply embedded in aristocratic culture that no amount of royal decree could root it out. To refuse a duel was social suicide. Better to risk the remote possibility of royal punishment than the certainty of social death. Now, let me take you into the experience more intimately. What follows represents the typical path of a gentleman in this era, drawn from numerous memoirs, letters, and historical accounts of men who lived through this period. The details, the training, the fears, the social pressures, all of these come directly from documented experiences. My name matters little to history. I was born in 1755 to a family of modest but respectable nobility in the Loire Valley of France. My father was a knight, my mother the daughter of a minor baron. We were not wealthy, but we were established. Our name carried weight in our province, and most importantly, we were unquestionably noble. That mattered more than gold in the France of my youth. Like many young men of my station, I was sent away at 15 to receive a gentleman's education. My family scraped together enough money to send me to a school in Paris run by a former military officer and his brother, a priest who handled the academic instruction. There, alongside sons of counts and viscounts and even two boys distantly related to the royal family, I learned what it meant to be a gentleman. We studied Latin and Greek, reading Cicero and Plutarch until we could recite passages from memory. We learned mathematics, enough to manage an estate and understand finances. We studied philosophy, history, and rhetoric. The priest, Father Dominique, was a stern but fair teacher who believed that a gentleman must be able to argue any position eloquently and defend his views with reason. He made us debate endlessly, switching sides mid-argument, teaching us to see multiple perspectives even as we learned to argue our own forcefully. But the education that mattered most to my future took place 3 afternoons a week in the fencing salle. The master who taught us was a man named Chevalier François Rousseau, a former cavalry officer who had served in the 7 Years' War and fought, by his own quiet admission, more duels than he cared to remember. He was in his 50s when I knew him, his hair iron gray, his body still straight and strong despite his age. The scars on his forearms, barely visible beneath his shirt cuffs, told stories he never spoke aloud. Chevalier Rousseau's fencing room was a long, high-ceilinged space with tall windows that let in the afternoon light. The floor was polished wood, perfect for footwork. Racks along the walls held practice weapons, foils with button tips, heavier training swords, even a few real small swords, their blades shining wickedly in the sunlight. The smell of that room stays with me still. Floor wax, leather, sweat, and something else, something almost metallic that I later recognized as fear. We were learning to kill and to avoid being killed, and some part of us always knew it. The first thing Chevalier Rousseau taught us was stance. For weeks, we did nothing but stand. Hold your body like this, feet positioned just so, weight distributed evenly, knees slightly bent, ready to move in any direction, left hand behind you for balance, or held out to the side, or holding a dagger for defense. He would walk among us with his ever-present cane, occasionally tapping a student who had let his guard drop or shifted his weight incorrectly. "A proper stance," he would intone in his gravelly voice, "is the foundation of everything. A house built on sand will fall. A swordsman who cannot stand correctly will die. The difference between the two is that the house does not know fear before it falls." Once we had mastered stance, we moved to footwork, advance and retreat, maintaining perfect distance, never crossing our feet, always balanced and ready. It sounds simple, but doing it correctly for hours while maintaining form was exhausting. My legs would shake, my lungs would burn, but Chevalier Rousseau never allowed us to stop until the lesson ended. "In a real fight," he told us, "you will be terrified. Your body will want to run or freeze. Only training can overcome this. When your mind screams in panic, your body must know what to do without thought. That is why we practice until your muscles remember even when your mind forgets." Then came the actual sword work. We learned guards, the positions from which all attacks and defenses flow. We learned attacks, thrusts, cuts, combinations. We learned parries, the blocks and deflections that kept an enemy's blade from your flesh. We learned ripostes, the counterattacks that followed a successful parry. Every movement had a name, a purpose, a proper execution. We drilled them endlessly, first slowly and carefully, then gradually faster as muscle memory took over. Chevalier Rousseau had a philosophy about teaching that I've never forgotten. "I am not teaching you to fight in a tournament," he would say. "Tournament fencing is a sport, a game with rules and referees. I am teaching you to survive an encounter where the only rule is survival, where your opponent will take any advantage, where one mistake means death or crippling injury. Remember this always. In a real duel, there are no second chances." As we progressed, he began teaching us the psychology of combat, how to read an opponent's eyes, which often telegraphed his intentions before his body moved, how to control your breathing to stay calm when adrenaline flooded your system, how to feint convincingly, making your opponent think you're attacking one target when you plan to strike another, how to recover from an awkward position, because in a real fight, you wouldn't always be in perfect form. He told us stories, too, though sparingly, stories of duels he had witnessed or fought, a man who died because he let his anger control him, attacking wildly and leaving himself open, another who survived impossible odds by staying calm and waiting for his opponent to make a mistake, a third who lost his nerve at the last moment, his sword hand shaking so badly he could barely hold his weapon, and died without landing a single blow. "Fear is natural," Chevalier Rousseau said. "Only a madman or a fool feels no fear when facing death. But you must learn to control fear, to use it, to let it sharpen your focus rather than dull it. The man who masters his fear masters the duel." But perhaps most importantly, he taught us the codes. Alongside our physical training, we studied the intricate rules that governed affairs of honor. The most famous was the Irish Code Duello, established at Clonmel in 1777, though variations existed throughout Europe. These weren't simple guidelines. They were detailed, legal-style documents covering every conceivable aspect of an affair of honor, written by men desperate to impose some order on what could otherwise become chaotic violence. We memorized key rules from the Irish Code Duello, that famous set of 26 commandments drawn up in 1777. Rule 1. The first offense requires the first apology, though the retort may have been more offensive than the insult. This meant that whoever gave the original insult had to apologize first, even if the response to that insult had been worse. It acknowledged that escalation happened, but insisted on addressing the root cause. Rule 4. When the lie direct is the first offense, the aggressor must either beg pardon in express terms, exchange 2 shots previous to apology, or 3 shots followed by explanation, or fire on till a severe hit be received by one party or the other. Being called a liar was one of the gravest insults possible, equivalent to having your entire character and honor questioned. The code recognized this by making it very difficult to resolve without violence. Rule 5. As a blow is strictly prohibited under any circumstances among gentlemen, no verbal apology can be received for such an insult. Physical violence between gentlemen was beyond the pale. If you struck another gentleman, you had committed an offense so severe that mere words couldn't resolve it. You had to be struck in return, or fight until one of you was seriously wounded. These rules went on for 26 articles, covering everything from the proper role of seconds to how to handle situations where both parties felt equally aggrieved. The codes acknowledged that dueling happened, but tried to channel it into controlled forms that gave hot tempers time to cool and provided multiple opportunities for peaceful resolution. Chevalier Rousseau would quiz us on the codes as we practiced. "You have insulted a man," he might say while we went through our drills. "He challenges you. You accept. Who chooses the weapons?" The answer, the challenged party, meaning the man who received the challenge, chose the weapons. The challenger chose the time and place. This was meant to balance things, giving advantages to each party. "You arrive at the dueling ground," he would continue. "Your second discovers that your opponent's pistol has a hair trigger that gives him an advantage. What do you do?" We would have to cite the appropriate rule, which specified that weapons must be equal, and that if an advantage was discovered, it must be corrected or new weapons provided. By the time I completed my education at 19, I could fence competently. Not brilliantly, not with the skill of a master, but well enough to defend myself and perhaps wound an opponent if fortune favored me. More importantly, I understood the intricate rules of honor that governed my world, rules that turned insults into challenges, challenges into duels, and duels into matters of life and death. I returned home to manage my family's estate, believing, hoping, that I would never need to use what I had learned. That hope lasted almost 2 years. My first challenge came in 1777. I had gone to Paris for the winter season, staying with my uncle, a prosperous wine merchant who had connections throughout Parisian society. He took me to salons, introduced me to influential people, helped me make connections that might benefit our family's interests. I was enjoying Paris, meeting interesting people, engaging in the sort of sophisticated conversation I had missed in our rural province. At one gathering, a card game began. I had always been a decent card player, and that evening, fortune smiled on me. I was winning steadily, modest amounts, but winning nonetheless. The other players seemed to take it in good spirits, until one hand when my partner and I won a particularly large pot. One of the other players, a young cavalry officer named Capitaine Laurent, glared at me across the table. He had been drinking, I realized, probably more than was wise. His face was flushed, his movements slightly unsteady. "Remarkable luck you're having," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made the table go quiet. "Fortune favors me tonight," I replied carefully, sensing danger. "Fortune," he repeated, "or perhaps something else. I couldn't help but notice you and your partner seem remarkably coordinated in your playing." The room went silent. Every person there understood the implication. He was suggesting we were cheating, signaling to each other about our cards. In a society where a man's word was his bond, where trust and honor were everything. To be called a cheat was to have your entire character impugned. It was an insult that could not be overlooked. I felt heat rising in my face, felt my hands clenching into fists beneath the table. My uncle's hand appeared on my shoulder, squeezing gently, a reminder to stay calm, to handle this correctly. I forced myself to take a slow breath, to remember everything Chevalier Rousseau had taught me about controlling emotions. I stood slowly, set down my cards with deliberate care, and spoke in a voice I kept carefully level. "Monsieur, you will either withdraw that remark and offer an apology, or you will give me satisfaction." There it was, the formal challenge. In that moment, everything changed. The casual social gathering transformed into something deadly serious. Laurent's face, already flushed, turned even redder. I suspect he hadn't really meant to make such a serious accusation, that the wine had loosened his tongue beyond his intentions. But in front of all those witnesses, he couldn't back down without appearing weak, without admitting he had spoken thoughtlessly. His honor, ironically, now demanded that he defend an accusation he might not have truly believed. He stood as well, swaying slightly. "I will not apologize for speaking the truth. If you wish satisfaction, you shall have it." The words hung in the air like smoke. There was no taking them back now. A challenge had been issued and accepted. My friend Armand, who had accompanied me that evening, stepped forward to act as my second. Laurent's friend, another officer whose name I later learned was Bernard, did the same. They bowed to each other stiffly and agreed to meet the next day to arrange the details. The rest of that evening passed in a blur. People murmured sympathetically. My uncle looked worried but said nothing, knowing there was nothing he could say that would change what was coming. I went through the motions of leaving, of returning to my uncle's house, of preparing for bed. But inside, I was already in turmoil. I barely slept that night. I lay in the dark guest room staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through 1,000 thoughts. What if I lost? What if my training failed me when it mattered most? What if the pistol misfired, or my hand shook at the crucial moment? What if I killed Laurent, a man I didn't even know, over a drunken insult at a card game? I thought about my mother, who had already lost my father to fever 3 years earlier. She had begged me to be careful in Paris, to avoid trouble, to come home safely. How would she react if I died there, killed in a duel over a game of cards? I thought about my younger sister, who depended on me now that our father was gone. Who would arrange her marriage, manage the estate, protect the family interests? But I also thought about honor, about the fact that if I backed down now, if I fled Paris, if I refused to appear, my name would be ruined. No one would do business with me. No respectable family would allow their daughter to marry me. Our family's position in society, carefully built over generations, would crumble. I would be marked as a coward, and that stain would follow me and my family forever. At dawn, my uncle came to my room. He didn't knock, just entered quietly and sat on the edge of my bed. His face was haggard, aged by worry and sleeplessness. He had fought several duels himself in his youth, I knew. He understood exactly what I was facing. "You know," he said quietly, "that pride has killed more men than any disease? That most duels are fought over things that won't matter in a month's time?" "I know," I replied, "and yet you will fight." "I have no choice. You know that." He nodded slowly. "Then fight well. Fight smart. Remember your training, and come home to breakfast." Armand arrived shortly after sunrise. He had spent the previous day negotiating with Bernard, Laurent's second. They had agreed on pistols at 30 paces, which was standard. Pistols were the democratic weapon, requiring less specialized training than swords. They gave each man an approximately equal chance and usually ended the matter with one exchange of fire. The meeting would be at 7 o'clock that morning at a meadow outside the city, a place secluded enough to avoid the authorities, but open enough for a clear line of sight. I dressed carefully in a white shirt and dark breeches, as was traditional. The white made it easier to see where a bullet had struck. Morbid, but practical. I ate nothing for breakfast. My stomach was a knot of ice, and food seemed impossible. I checked my affairs one last time. A letter to my mother, sealed and ready to be sent if the worst happened. Instructions for settling my debts. A note to my sister telling her I loved her. The carriage ride to the dueling ground was the longest of my life. Paris was just beginning to wake as we clattered through the narrow streets. Bakers opened their shops, releasing the smell of fresh bread. Street vendors set up their stalls. Life continued, oblivious to the drama about to unfold in a meadow beyond the city walls. I watched it all through the carriage window, wondering if these might be the last ordinary sights I ever saw. Armand tried to make conversation, offering advice, attempting to keep my spirits up, but his voice seemed to come from far away. All I could think about was what awaited me. I had practiced shooting, of course. Chevalier Rousseau had made sure all his students understood firearms as well as swords, but hitting a target on a range was vastly different from hitting a man who might kill you first. We arrived to find Laurent and Bernard already there. A surgeon stood off to one side, his black bag at his feet, his face carefully neutral. He had doubtless seen many such encounters, had staunched many wounds, had watched many men die. His presence was both reassuring and terrifying, a reminder that what we were about to do was deadly serious. Laurent looked pale but determined. The flush from last night's wine had faded, leaving him wan in the morning light. We nodded to each other stiffly, maintaining the cold courtesy the code demanded. Whatever personal animosity might exist between us, we were both gentlemen, and gentlemen behaved with dignity even when preparing to kill each other. Our seconds had brought a case of matched pistols, beautiful weapons with walnut stocks and brass fittings. I recognized them as belonging to a professional dueling set, carefully balanced, with smooth bores and reliable firing mechanisms. Bernard and Armand loaded them in full view of both of us, ensuring neither weapon had been tampered with, that both were equally prepared. Then they paced out the ground, 30 steps, heel to toe, and marked each spot with a handkerchief weighted with a stone. Armand took my coat and handed me one of the pistols. It was heavier than I expected, cold in my hand despite the warming morning. He met my eyes, his expression serious. "Aim for his torso," he said quietly. "Don't try for a fancy shot. Don't aim for his head or his arm. Just point at the center of his body and squeeze gently when you're ready. And remember to hold your fire until the command is given. If you fire early, even by accident, you dishonor yourself and he gets a free shot at you." I nodded, not trusting my voice. I walked to my mark, the grass wet with dew beneath my boots. Laurent walked to his. We turned to face each other. 30 paces suddenly seemed like no distance at all. I could see his face clearly, could see that he was just as frightened as I was. His hand trembled slightly as he held his pistol. We were both young men, barely out of our teens, about to try to kill each other over a drunken insult at a card game. The absurdity of it struck me like a physical blow. But there was no stopping now. The machinery of honor had been set in motion, and it would not stop until blood had been shed or luck had intervened. Bernard and Armand conferred briefly, then Armand raised his hand. "Gentlemen, you may raise your weapons and fire when ready. Fire on my mark or at will after the mark is given." The moment stretched out forever. Everything became strangely clear and sharp. I could hear a bird singing in a tree behind Laurent, its song oddly cheerful in the deadly morning. I could see individual blades of grass bending in the slight breeze. I could feel my heartbeat, strong and fast, pounding in my chest like it was trying to escape my body before the bullet could find it. I raised my pistol, trying to steady my shaking hand. Laurent raised his as well. Time seemed to slow, every detail burning into my memory with crystalline clarity, the way the morning light caught the metal of his pistol, the white of his shirt against the dark trees behind him, the way he was standing, slightly sideways to present less of a target, just as we'd all been taught. Armand's hand came down. "Fire!" The two reports came almost simultaneously, so close together they nearly blended into one thunderous crack that echoed across the field and sent birds scattering from nearby trees. I felt something hot pass close to my left ear, close enough that I heard it hum through the air. My own shot went wide, striking a tree trunk behind Laurent with a solid thunk that sent bark flying. We stood there, both of us alive, both of us having fired and missed. According to the code, honor was now satisfied. We had both demonstrated our courage, our willingness to risk our lives. The actual hitting or missing mattered less than the fact that we had stood there and faced death without flinching. The seconds rushed forward. "Gentlemen, are you satisfied?" Armand called out, his voice carrying across the field. Laurent and I looked at each other across the misty ground. I could see relief flooding his face, matching the relief I felt washing through my own body like warm water. The tension that had gripped me since last night suddenly released, leaving me almost lightheaded. He nodded. "I am satisfied," he said, his voice shaky but clear. "As am I," I replied. Just like that, it was over. We met in the middle of the field, and to my surprise, Laurent extended his hand. I took it, and we shook firmly. His grip was warm, alive, real. An hour ago, I had been prepared to kill this man. Now we stood as near equals, having shared an experience that few understood. "I spoke foolishly last night," Laurent said quietly. "The wine was talking, not my better judgment. You play cards fairly, I have no doubt." "And I took offense too quickly," I replied. "I was winning, and perhaps too proud of it." We stood there awkwardly for a moment. Then both of us started laughing, a slightly hysterical sound of pure relief. We had survived. We were alive. The sun was rising, the world continued to turn, and we would both see another day. Within a month, Laurent and I had become friends. We discovered we had much in common: similar backgrounds, similar education, similar perspectives on the world. He later told me he'd also spent a sleepless night before our duel, equally terrified and equally trapped by the demands of honor. The duel that might have killed one of us instead created a bond that lasted years. But I had crossed a threshold. I was now a man who had fought a duel. I had proven I was no coward. And that proof, paradoxically, made me both more respected and more vulnerable. A man known to have dueled and survived was a man whose honor had been tested and proven. Others would be more careful with me, true, but also more willing to challenge if they felt insulted, knowing I wouldn't back down. Over the next 15 years, I was involved in 4 more affairs of honor. 2 were settled by negotiation between seconds before reaching the dueling ground. 1 ended after a single exchange of fire where both parties missed and declared honor satisfied. But 1, fought with swords in 1789 just as revolution was beginning to convulse France, left me with a scar across my ribs that I carry to this day. That duel was different from my first. My opponent was Comte de Valois, a man who had insulted my sister publicly at a gathering. He had suggested she was too forward, too bold in her manner, that she lacked the modesty proper to a woman of breeding. In front of witnesses, he made her seem like someone of questionable virtue. For that, there could be no negotiation. Her honor was my honor, and his insult had to be answered with steel. We fought at dawn in the traditional manner, but with swords rather than pistols. Valois was an experienced swordsman, I knew, and the prospect terrified me more than pistols would have. With pistols, Luck played a larger role. With swords, skill mattered more, and I knew I was outmatched. But anger gave me strength. The thought of my sister's reputation being damaged by this man's careless words, the image of her tearful face when she told me what he had said, all of it focused my mind with a clarity I had never experienced before. When we engaged, I fought not with perfect technique, but with furious determination. Our blades met with a sharp ring of steel on steel. We circled each other, testing defenses, looking for openings. Valois was good, better than me technically, but he was also overconfident. He thought this would be a quick matter, that he would easily wound me and have done with it. That overconfidence was his mistake. The fight didn't last long, maybe 2 minutes, though it felt like an eternity. I remember the sweat on my palms, the way my breathing came fast and hard, the burning in my shoulder from holding the sword extended. I remember Valois' face, concentrated and slightly annoyed, as if I was taking too long to be defeated. And then I saw it. A tiny gap in his defense, his blade slightly out of position, his balance shifted forward just a fraction too far. Without thinking, purely on trained instinct, I lunged. My blade slipped past his guard and caught him in the thigh, not deep, but deep enough to draw blood and send him stumbling backward. At almost the same moment, his blade caught me across the ribs. I felt the cold sting of steel parting skin, felt warm blood begin to flow. We both fell back, both wounded, both suddenly aware that we had actually hurt each other. The surgeon rushed forward. Our seconds called an end to the duel. Both of us had been wounded. Both had demonstrated courage. Honor was satisfied. The surgeon examined both wounds and pronounced them non-fatal, though painful. Mine would heal within weeks. Valois' thigh wound would take longer, and he would walk with a slight limp ever after. But we had both survived. And strangely, that duel affected me more deeply than my first. I had actually wounded a man. I had felt my blade part his flesh. I had seen his blood. And he had wounded me in return. The scar on my ribs became a permanent reminder of that morning, a white line across my skin that never fully faded. Living as a duelist, as a man whose honor had been publicly tested multiple times, brought a strange mix of respect and isolation. People treated me with careful courtesy. They watched their words around me. I never had trouble with anyone trying to cheat me in business or questioning my word in dealings. Young men sometimes sought me out, hoping to learn swordsmanship or to hear tales of my encounters. But there was always a distance, an unspoken acknowledgement that I was a man of violence, that I had been forced to maim another human being to defend honor. People looked at me differently. Mothers with marriageable daughters were both attracted to my proven courage and wary of the violence I represented. Men were friendly but cautious, careful not to give accidental offense. The psychological toll was real, though we rarely discussed it. I had nightmares occasionally about what might have happened if my blade had struck differently, if I had killed Valois instead of merely wounding him. I thought often about Laurent, our near miss, how close we had both come to ending a life over a drunken misunderstanding. The weight of it pressed on me in quiet moments, made me more cautious in my words, more careful in my conduct. Yet I couldn't have done otherwise. In the world I inhabited, to refuse a challenge after such an insult would have been to declare my sister's honor unworthy of defense. It would have marked our entire family. So I fought, and he was wounded, and I was wounded, and we both lived with the scars of a system that demanded blood in exchange for honor. There were men who became obsessed with dueling, who seemed to seek out opportunities for challenges. The Count of Bouteville in France fought numerous duels, killing at least half his opponents, before he was finally executed by Cardinal Richelieu in 1627 as an example to others. There were stories of men who dueled dozens of times, accumulating kill counts that would shame a professional soldier. These men became celebrities of a sort, feared and admired, their reputations preceding them like shadows. But most of us were simply men trying to navigate a social system that demanded we risk our lives over matters that, in calmer moments, we knew were trivial. We didn't want to fight. We certainly didn't want to kill or be killed, but the alternative, social death and family dishonor, seemed worse than the physical danger. The famous duel between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr in 1804 shocked America and the world, not because duels were rare, but because Hamilton was so prominent and his death seemed so senseless to a public whose attitudes were beginning to change. Hamilton had been reluctant to fight, and many historians believe he may have planned to throw away his shot, firing into the air or missing deliberately, though this remains debated. Burr, feeling his political career and reputation had been destroyed by Hamilton's opposition, was determined to have satisfaction. Burr's shot struck Hamilton in the abdomen, cutting major blood vessels and lodging in his spine. Hamilton was rowed back across the Hudson River to his home in New York, where he suffered in agony through the next day before dying on July 12th. His final hours were filled with regret and pain. His family gathered around him, his young children barely understanding that their father was leaving them forever. Burr's life was ruined by that duel, not because he fought it, but because public opinion had begun to turn against the practice. He was charged with murder in both New York and New Jersey, though never brought to trial. His political career ended. Friends abandoned him. He became hated, the man who had killed Alexander Hamilton. The duel that was supposed to restore his honor instead destroyed what remained of it. I witnessed this changing attitude in my own lifetime. When I fought my first duel in 1777, it was accepted, even expected among my class. By the time of my last challenge in 1801, attitudes were shifting. More people questioned the practice openly. Religious leaders condemned it as murder disguised as honor. Enlightenment philosophers like Jeremy Bentham argued that dueling was irrational, that honor could be satisfied through other means, that civilized societies should settle disputes through law and discourse, not violence. The rising middle class, merchants and professionals whose power came from wealth and skill rather than ancient family names, had less patience for the old-fashioned code of honor. Evidence suggests they maintained their reputations through the new power of the press, defending themselves in newspapers rather than on dueling grounds. They brought lawsuits for slander rather than issuing challenges. This shift in how reputation was defended reflects a broader change in how honor itself was thought about, moving from public displays of courage to showing professional honesty and family virtue. Young men who a generation earlier would have eagerly learned swordsmanship now focused on business and law. The old codes seemed increasingly archaic, relics of a violent past that an industrializing world was leaving behind. Urban planning and effective police forces made street violence less common and less acceptable. The very concept of honor was changing, becoming more personal, less dependent on public reputation, and more on private conscience and character. But the death blow to dueling in much of Europe came from an unlikely source: World War I. The unimaginable killing of that conflict, the millions of young men cut down in their prime by machine guns and heavy artillery, completely changed how European societies viewed violence. When an entire generation had been killed in the trenches of France and Belgium, when every family had lost someone to the war's brutal efficiency, the idea of killing more young men over personal insults became disgusting. The practice that had survived centuries of legal prohibition and moral condemnation finally withered in the face of industrial-scale death. Men who had seen their friends blown apart by artillery shells, who had watched thousands die in single days for a few yards of mud, could no longer take seriously the idea of formal combat over an insult at a dinner party. The honor culture that had sustained dueling was shattered by a war that made honor seem like a cruel joke. In America, the Civil War had a similar effect decades earlier. The Southern aristocracy that had clung most tightly to dueling culture was shattered by the war. Between 1861 and 1865, over 600,000 Americans died, the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history. The South, which had lost, was devastated. The plantation economy collapsed. The social structure that had supported dueling fell apart. In the aftermath, a man's worth became measured more by his ability to rebuild, to make money, to survive in a changing economy, than by his willingness to fight duels. The honor culture didn't disappear entirely, but it transformed, became less about formal combat and more about personal integrity in business and family life. By the early 20th century, dueling had become a curiosity, a relic of a bygone age. The last formal duel in France was fought in 1967 between Gaston Defferre and René Ribière, both politicians who had insulted each other in Parliament. They fought with swords, both were slightly wounded, and the whole affair was treated by the press as an eccentric throwback to an earlier era. The last legal duel in Uruguay wasn't until 1992, though by then it was so rare as to be almost a performance, something done more for tradition than from genuine belief in honor culture. Looking back now in the quiet of my old age, I wonder what it was all for. I survived my duels. I proved my courage according to the standards of my time. My honor was tested and found sufficient. But what did I really gain? The men I fought were not my enemies until honor made them so. The man I wounded with my sword lived, but he carried a limp for the rest of his life as a reminder of our encounter. That weighs on me. And the system that demanded these encounters, that forced young men to risk everything over insults and slights, seems like madness in retrospect. How many brilliant men died young on dueling grounds? How many poets and philosophers and scientists and leaders were cut down over nothing? The French nobility, as I mentioned, lost thousands during the reigns of Henry IV and Louis XIII. Those men could have built, created, discovered. Instead, they died for honor. Yet I cannot fully condemn it either, for to do so would be to condemn my entire world, everything I was taught to value, everyone I knew and loved. We were products of our time, shaped by codes and expectations we did not create but could not escape. We did what honor demanded because honor was our currency, our worth, our identity. Without it, we were nothing. With it, we were gentlemen, men of standing, men whose word mattered. Perhaps that is the real lesson of dueling. Not that our ancestors were barbaric or foolish, but that they were human, caught in systems that seemed as natural and inevitable to them as our own systems seem to us. They fought for honor because honor mattered in their world in ways we can barely comprehend. They risked death over insults because their entire social existence depended on their reputation. To us it seems crazy. To them, it was life. When I am gone, and the last men who fought formal duels are gone with me, this practice will live only in history books and dramatic tales. It will seem romantic to some, who will imagine noble swordsmen and gallant pistoliers. It will seem horrifying to others, who will shake their heads at the senseless violence. It will seem baffling to most, who won't understand how something so dangerous and irrational could have been accepted for so long. But to those of us who lived it, it was simply part of life. Dangerous, yes, senseless perhaps when viewed from a distance, but ours. It defined us, it tested us, it shaped us. The fields where I fought are peaceful now, returned to farmers or swallowed by expanding cities. The pistols I used rust in a case in my study. The scars have faded to white lines on aging skin that few but I remember or understand. But the memories remain clear as yesterday. The weight of the weapon in my hand, the taste of fear like copper on my tongue, the profound relief of survival, the haunting knowledge of having wounded another human being in combat, the strange respect and distance that followed me afterward. All of it is still vivid in my mind. This was dueling, not the romantic flourish of fiction, but the cold reality of men killing men over honor. It shaped societies, ended lives, created legends, and left behind scars both visible and invisible. It was a practice born of specific cultural conditions, sustained by powerful social forces, and finally abandoned when those forces changed. But for the centuries it lasted, it was as real and as important to those who lived with it as any institution we have today. And now you understand. You've walked with me through the history, through the training, through the terror and the aftermath. You've seen dueling not as an abstract historical practice, but as a lived experience, with all its contradictions and complexities. You've felt the weight of honor culture, understood why men risked everything for something intangible, and witnessed how an entire social system could be built around formalized violence. If you found this journey through history compelling, I encourage you to like and subscribe for more stories from the shadows of the past. Because history isn't just dates and facts. It's people, with all their courage and fear, their honor and their folly, their brilliance and their blindness. And their stories deserve to be told, understood, and remembered, so that we might better understand ourselves and the strange, complicated journey that brought us to where we are today. Until next time, remember that every age has its own madness, its own codes, its own ways of doing things that seem natural in the moment, but bizarre in retrospect. Ours will seem just as strange to those who come after. The question is, will they judge us as harshly as we judge the duelists? Or will they try to understand, as I hope you now understand, that people do what their world demands of them, and that honor, whatever form it takes, is a powerful force that shapes human behavior in ways both noble and tragic.